Hello there. I'm going to explain this week's lesson to you. Starting in Period 5, Grade 8 Science, but this also applies to Period 7 and Period 8 for Grade 8 Science. I can show you that there's a new week here, week of April 6th to April 9th. You can click on the link. You can go in and you can see that the work I have for you to do is tide charts. So you're going to start with one that's called Baja, Mexico Tides Bar and Line Graph Plus Worksheet Packet. So I'm going to click on this and I'm going to read you the directions and then we'll go through what I want you to do. So part one, it says read all the directions on the Tide Worksheet. So there's a link here. You are going to want to make a copy of it. So file, make a copy, and then I always like for you, and even myself, to take out the copy and like write your initials. So I could write like JC, your initials, and then I have my own copy. You do not need to request access. This is the Tide worksheet. So let me go back and show you again here. It says read all the directions on the Tide worksheet, Tides Graph Lab, Baja, Mexico. So here's the copy I made. And the directions are as follows. It says read the paragraphs below and scan the table on the following page, then answer questions 1 through 6. So I'm going to read the paragraphs for you. It says people that make their living on or from the sea, such as fishermen and sailors, must pay careful attention to the tides. Even people that simply enjoy visiting the beach or going boating are affected by the daily tidal cycle. In many areas, there's just a foot or two difference between successive high and low tides. However, this difference, called the tidal range, varies over time from place to place. The greatest tidal range in the world occurs in Canada's Bay of Fundy, where the differences between low and high tide can be as much as 21 meters, which is nearly 70 feet. And if you recall, you saw a little video of that as a mini lesson, not last week, but the week before, where you could see how quickly, or not how quickly, but how far up the tide came in on high tide to where it was when it was at low tide, and the boats were just sitting on the sand. The greatest tidal range, this is the next paragraph, the highest tides and lowest tides all occur when the sun and moon are lined up. As you will see below, these so-called spring tides occur in a regular pattern. Some animals, horseshoes, crabs, sea turtles, for example, lay eggs on shore on the date of the highest high tide in a season. The smallest tidal range, lowest high tides, and the highest low tides also occur in a regular pattern. These are called neap tides. So that's a little bit of background information for you. And then here's the 6 questions I want you to answer. Number 1 says, look at the data for high and low tide levels on the table on the next page. Find the highest high tide and the lowest low tide and write down the date of each. These are spring tides. So you can do that now right under number 1. Number 2 question or task says, look at the table and find the dates of the lowest high tide and the highest low tide and write them down. These are neap tides. Number 3, this is a part some students get confused on, so I'm going to explain it more clearly when you see the table. It says, now calculate the tidal range for each day by finding the difference between high tide and low tide levels for that day. Record it in the column titled Tidal Range. The value for January 1 is given, so I gave you an example for that. Now, when you find the difference, you're just subtracting the low tide from the high tide, or you take the number from high tide minus the low tide number to get your tidal range. However, if you have a negative low tide, what's going to happen is you're going to actually end up adding high tide and low tide together because 2 negatives equal a positive. And I've shown you that in the chart below. If you forget, you'll see. We're going to move on to, oops, sorry, just moved it back up to number 4. It says, look at the day-to-day changes and the difference between high and low tide. look at your tidal range on the data table. Describe any patterns that you detect. So look closely at the tidal range pattern and see if you notice like the numbers going up, going down, kind of remaining the same. Just look for some patterns. So number 5, the phases of the moon gradually change in a regular pattern from a new moon to a full moon, and then back to a new moon. And you probably have learned, I know some of you did with Mr. Altavia, the 8 phases of the moon. And so for number 5, it says add the following information on the dates of the various lunar phases to the data table. So you're going to just write it next to it or add another column, but add in the first quarter moon on January 2nd, the last quarter moon on January 16th. You can add a column to that table down there on the right, and then the full moon on January 9th and the new moon on January 24th. And then finally, number 6, it says find a relationship between the pattern of high and low tides by looking at the graphs you made on Google Sheets and the lunar phases, those are the moon phases, mentioned in question 5. Describe the relationships and patterns you see. So I'm going to show you the data table right here. So again, it asks you to add in the phases of the moon. I can actually add in another column here. Insert, let's see, table. Actually, I think I can do it from right here. Insert column to right. So right here, I may want to move over, and we can move this, make that smaller. And I'm going to go ahead and call this moon phases. Okay. Now you can write those dates in there. So again, for I believe it's number 5, you have to write in the tidal range right here, all the way down to, it's from January 1st to January 30th, and I've done number 1 for you. And you can see the tidal range right here is 0.05, and I got that answer by simply using my calculator. I put in 0.54 minus 0.49, and my answer is 0.05. Because 0.49 plus 0.05, you're going to get 0.54, okay? But again, I wrote up here for you to remember, and actually I think I'll highlight this for you. Really important. That's not my text color. I don't know where my fill color is. Highlight color, let's do, I guess, orange. 2 negatives equal a positive, so add the low tide to the high tide when the low tide is a negative number, okay? And these high tides and low tides are all done in meters. Okay, so next thing I'm going to show you quickly is the second part of this assignment. So this could be, you could do this on Thursday, for instance, and you could do the first half tomorrow, which is Tuesday. I'll talk about it tomorrow. I'll play this tomorrow. This is Monday right now. And it asks you on the assignment, part 2, create a bar graph using the data for Baja tides and Sheets. It's Google Sheets. I actually already put in the data for you. And what I want you to do is to create a bar graph. Make sure you have a title, subtitle, x-axis title, y-axis title. You can add a legend to the right, put in data labels, which is found within the series. That adds in your specific data points so you can see the numbers on the entire graph. And then once you've made that graph, you're going to copy it, which you're going to see the graph that it creates. And I believe on the top right, there'll be like 3 little buttons, and you can select copy. And then you're going to open a new Google Doc and then copy and paste it in there. And I want you to name that Google document your name plus Tide's Worksheet Graphs. Then you're going to go back to your Google Sheets where you have the bar graph, and you're going to change it to a line graph. which is fairly easy. You just go back to Insert Chart and pick a line graph as opposed to a bar graph. And then you'll put that, copy and paste it into your Google Sheet again. And then at the very end of that Google Sheet, you're going to explain, and this is on number 7, which graph, bar or line, visually represents the relationship the best way for you. Like, which do you prefer to use to make sense of how high tides and low tides work here in Baja, Mexico, and what that looks like on a tide chart? Because definitely graphs are way more visually representative than a data table, which is just numbers. When you're looking at it, you do not necessarily see patterns right away that you would see in a graph. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to make another video on how to make that graph. So I'll be back in a minute.